All right, so today we're doing a deep dive on something you probably have in your medicine cabinet right now.
Most likely, yeah.
Acetaminophen, or paracetamol, depending on where you are in the world.
The two names for the same thing. Always interesting to see that.
Yeah, we'll get into that. But first, think about this. Over 60 million Americans pop this stuff every week.
Wow.
That's like, what, 25 billion doses a year in the U.S. alone? Wild.
It really is a go-to for so many people. For pain,
Yeah.
for fever, just simple relief.
Exactly. But for something so commonplace, do we actually know that much about it? I mean, really know it.
That's the question, isn't it? It's easy to take it for granted, like it's just there.
Yeah.
But acetaminophen has a whole backstory, and it's not always straightforward.
Not at all. Like, on the one hand, it's considered safe, right? When used correctly, of course.
Yeah, when used as directed, it's generally considered safe and effective.
But then there's this whole other side, the liver damage issue, especially with overdoses.
Right. That's a major concern. Definitely something to be aware of.
It's kind of a paradox. And here's another thing that really struck me. Even after, like, over a century of doctors using this stuff, we still don't fully understand how it works.
Yeah, that's always a bit humbling, isn't it? We use it so much, yet the precise mechanisms are still being unraveled.
So in this deep dive, we're going to break it all down for you. The history, the science, the regulations, the controversies, all of it. We want to give you the real deal on acetaminophen.
I think that's so important to really empower people with knowledge about the things they put in their bodies.
Absolutely. So first up, let's tackle that two-name thing. Acetaminophen, paracetamol. What gives?
Well, it's basically a historical quirk. Both names refer to the exact same chemical compound.
So like synonyms.
Exactly. But it comes down to differences in how drugs were named in different parts of the world. Acetaminophen is the USN, the United States adopted name. You'll see it used in the US, Canada, Japan, some South American countries.
And it's based on the chemical structure, right? N-acetyl-P-aminophenol.
You got it. It's kind of like reading the chemical formula in a specific way.
Makes sense. Okay, so then paracetamol is the other version of that.
Yep, that's the International Non-Proprietary Name, the INN. It's managed by the WHO, the World Health Organization. They're trying to provide a single global standard for drug names. So paracetamol, that's what they use in the UK, most of Europe, Australia, India, lots of other places.
So basically, same chemical, different naming conventions.
Exactly. It's a historical thing that can definitely cause some confusion, especially for travelers or people reading medical information from different countries.
Yeah, I can see that. And then there's the brand name, Tylenol. That's kind of the king of acetaminophen in the US, at least.
Right, and that actually comes from the chemical name, too. If you look closely, it's like they took bits and pieces of N-acetyl-P-aminophenol and made it into Tylenol.
Clever branding, huh? So all these names, it's all the same stuff.
Exactly. It's just important to know the different names because you might see them used interchangeably.
Okay, good to know. So acetaminophen, paracetamol, whatever you call it, when did it actually become the go-to for pain and fever?
Its popularity really took off in the mid-20th century, especially after research in the late 40s and early 50s really started to shed light on its properties.
And how did it position itself against other pain relievers at the time? Back then, aspirin was the big dog, right?
Aspirin was huge, yeah. But it also came with some downsides. Acetaminophen, on the other hand, was marketed as being gentler on the stomach. It didn't have that same risk of causing ulcers or bleeding.
So it was playing the safety card.
Absolutely. And they also contrasted it with phenacetin, another pain reliever popular at the time. Acetaminophen didn't seem to have the same worries about kidney problems or blood disorders that phenacetin did.
Okay, so safer stomach, safer kidneys, safer blood. That's a pretty good pitch.
It was. And McNeil Laboratories, the company behind Tylenol, they really leveraged those advantages. They focused their early marketing on doctors and pharmacists, explaining these safety benefits, making the case for Tylenol.
Smart move. Get the medical professionals on board, and then it trickles down.
Exactly. But then a major turning point happened, especially for acetaminophen's use in kids, and that was the link between aspirin and Ray's syndrome.
Right, that was a big deal. For folks who don't know, Ray's syndrome is a rare but very serious illness. It can cause brain swelling and liver damage, mostly in kids.
Exactly. And it's often triggered by a viral infection like the flu or chickenpox. What happened was, in the 70s and 80s, more and more reports started coming out linking Ray's syndrome to aspirin use in kids with these viral infections.
So that was a huge red flag.
It was. The medical community issued warnings, recommendations against giving aspirin to children.
And that's where acetaminophen really stepped in, right?
Exactly. Parents were understandably looking for a safer option for their kids, and acetaminophen fit the bill.
It became the go-to for kids' pain and fever. Okay, let's go back a bit. McNeil Laboratories, they were the ones who brought us Tylenol. How did that all start?
Well, the story begins in 1879 with Robert McNeil. He started out with a drugstore in Philadelphia.
Humble beginnings.
Yeah, and the business grew over the years, passed down through the family. By the late 1940s, McNeil Laboratories was established. They set their sights on developing a new prescription pain reliever.
Interesting. So even back then, they were looking for new and improved options.
They were. We were influenced by doctors like James Roth, who was raising concerns about aspirin side effects and actually advocating for acetaminophen.
So acetaminophen was already on the radar.
It was. And in 1951, there was a symposium where some positive findings about acetaminophen were presented. That spurred McNeil to do their own research, and they confirmed its safety and effectiveness.
So they were like, okay, this is promising. What was their first product with acetaminophen?
The first one was a prescription elixir called Algocin. Came out in 1953. It actually combined acetaminophen with a barbiturate.
Interesting combo.
Yeah, but the game changer came in 1955. Tylenol elixir for children. This was their first product with just acetaminophen, no other active ingredients.
And that was initially only available with a prescription, right?
It was. And they had a really interesting marketing approach. Instead of going for big public advertising campaigns, they focused their efforts on doctors and pharmacists.
Direct to the source.
Exactly. They provided all the information about aspirin side effects and presented Tylenol as the safe alternative, particularly for kids. That strategy really paid off. Tylenol became widely accepted and prescribed within the medical community.
So targeted marketing and a safer alternative, a recipe for success. Okay, we've talked about the history, the rise to fame. Let's get into what acetaminophen actually does. Clinically, what are its main uses?
Well, as we've mentioned, its primary use is for pain relief. Mild to moderate pain, that is, and for reducing fever.
So your everyday aches and pains, headaches, fevers.
Exactly. And its effectiveness for those uses is well documented. It's often the first line of treatment for those common ailments.
And does it work for all kinds of pain equally well?
It's considered very effective for certain types of pain, like tension headaches and even migraines, especially when combined with aspirin and caffeine. There's good evidence for its use in post-surgical pain as well.
So helpful after you've had a procedure.
Yes, and interestingly, some research shows it might be even more effective for post-op pain when combined with ibuprofen than either drug alone.
So a 1-2 punch. What about chronic pain? Things like osteoarthritis, for example.
For osteoarthritis, the evidence is a bit more mixed. The pain relief it provides tends to be small, not always noticeable for people.
So not a miracle worker for everything.
Right. And unfortunately, there's not enough evidence to support its use for other types of chronic pain, like back pain, cancer pain, or nerve pain.
Okay, so mostly for acute pain and fever. Speaking of fever, how does it compare to other fever reducers? Ibuprofen, for example.
Yeah, so in children particularly, studies often show ibuprofen to be slightly more effective at lowering a fever than acetaminophen. And there's actually a lot of debate in the medical community about whether routinely suppressing fever, especially in common viral illnesses, is always the best approach.
So sometimes it might be better to let the fever run its course.
Well, there are nuances to that. Some studies have looked at this in critically ill patients, and they found that acetaminophen only caused a very slight decrease in temperature, and it didn't actually improve outcomes or survival rates.
Huh, surprising.
Yeah, and it also didn't show any benefit in febrile stroke or dengue fever. In fact, in dengue fever, it was linked to higher liver enzyme elevation. So using acetaminophen solely for fever in hospitalized patients, it doesn't have strong support.
That's good to know. I think a lot of people just assume reducing fever is always a good thing. Okay, so now let's compare acetaminophen to other common pain relievers, aspirin and ibuprofen. How do they stack up in terms of effectiveness and safety?
Sure. So let's start with effectiveness. We're talking about kids under 2. For both fever and pain relief. The research suggests that ibuprofen might be more effective than acetaminophen. There's even this measure called number needed to treat. It tells you how many kids you'd need to treat to see a benefit in one child.
So like a way to quantify the effectiveness.
Exactly. But once kids reach around 5 years old, the effectiveness seems to be more similar between acetaminophen and ibuprofen. When it comes to adults with acute pain, both are considered effective first-line treatments. However, NSAIDs like ibuprofen might be better at improving physical function.
Okay, so for little ones, ibuprofen might have the edge, but for older kids and adults, it's more similar. Now, let's talk safety. Acetaminophen has a reputation for being gentle on the stomach, right?
It does. And that's generally true. One of its big advantages is that it's less likely to cause those gastrointestinal issues that aspirin and other NSAIDs can. It also doesn't really affect blood clotting, which is a big difference from aspirin.
So it's often the preferred choice for people who have stomach problems or are on blood thinners.
Exactly. But it's really important to remember that acetaminophen has its own safety risk. Liver damage if you take too much.
Right, we talked about that earlier.
It's a dose-dependent issue. The more you take, the higher the risk. And that's not something you typically see with NSAIDs at normal doses. Now, NSAIDs have their own set of risks, like kidney problems, heart issues, and bleeding. So it's really about weighing the different risks and benefits. Acetaminophen has also been linked to some rare but serious skin reactions.
So no drug is completely risk-free.
Right. And when it comes to short-term safety in kids, some reviews suggest that acetaminophen and ibuprofen have similar rates of side effects. But one big analysis did indicate that acetaminophen might have a slightly lower overall rate of adverse events in kids with fever. And it's worth noting that long-term, regular use of acetaminophen, even at recommended doses, has been linked to lower hemoglobin and some liver test abnormalities in certain people.
So there's always a balance to strike. What about how they actually work in the body? We know they reduce pain and fever, but through different mechanisms, right?
Yes, acetaminophen is very weak when it comes to anti-inflammatory properties. Aspirin and NSAIDs, on the other hand, they work by inhibiting KOX enzymes, which are key players in inflammation.
So NSAIDs are better at tackling inflammation directly.
Exactly. That makes them more suitable for conditions where inflammation is a major driver of the pain. Acetaminophen seems to work its magic in a different way. It primarily targets pain and fever through pathways that aren't as directly related to inflammation.
Okay, so for something like a sprained ankle where there's obvious swelling, ibuprofen might be the better choice.
That's a good example. Now, there's also some interesting research emerging about potential uses for acetaminophen beyond just pain and fever.
That sounds intriguing. For such a common drug, you wouldn't think there'd be much left to discover.
Right, but there are some studies looking at possible effects on things like blood sugar control and even muscle health.
Really? How does that work?
Well, it's thought that acetaminophen's antioxidant properties might play a role. For instance, some studies in animals have shown that it could potentially help improve blood sugar control in diabetes and obesity.
That would be huge.
It would. And there's also preclinical work suggesting that it might counteract age-related muscle loss.
Wow, that's fascinating. So are we close to seeing doctors recommend acetaminophen for these new uses?
Not quite yet. It's important to emphasize that this research is still in its early stages. Most of these studies have been done in labs or in animals. We need a lot more research, especially clinical trials in humans, to really understand if these findings translate to real-world benefits.
So exciting possibilities, but we need more data.
Exactly. And we always have to keep in mind the known safety issues, even with these potential new uses.
Of course. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, let's talk about how acetaminophen is actually made. All those billions of doses, it's going to be a massive production process.
It is. The most common way it's made industrially is through a process called N-acetylation of p-aminophenol.
Okay, break that down for us.
Basically, you start with this chemical called p-aminophenol. It has a specific group of atoms called an acetamine group. Then you react it with another chemical that can add an acetyl group, which is a key part of the acetaminophen molecule. The most commonly used acetylating agent is acetic anhydride.
And what does that reaction produce?
Well, you get acetaminophen, of course, and acetic acid is produced as a byproduct.
Ah, so that's where the vinegar smell comes from.
Well, not exactly, but acetic acid is the main component of vinegar. The reaction usually happens in a solvent. This could be water, a mix of water and isopropanol, acetic acid itself, or even benzene in some cases. Sometimes a little bit of acid, like phosphoric acid, is added to help speed up the reaction.
So it's kind of like cooking, but with chemicals instead of food?
In a way, yeah. You're controlling conditions to get the desired product, and then there's quality control that's absolutely essential in drug manufacturing. They perform all sorts of tests on both the raw acetaminophen powder, which they call the API, and the finished products, the tablets or liquids you buy.
So how do they make sure it's actually acetaminophen and not something else?
One way is using techniques like spectroscopy. They shine specific types of light on the substance and look at how it interacts. This creates a unique fingerprint that they can compare to a reference standard of pure acetaminophen. They also use chromatography, which separates out the different components of a mixture. It's like running a race. Different chemicals move at different speeds, so they get separated, and you can see what's in there.
Very cool. And how do they make sure each pill has the right dose?
They do assay tests, which measure the exact amount of acetaminophen in a sample, and there are strict standards set by organizations like the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. For the pure acetaminophen ingredient, the allowed range is very narrow, maybe like 98% to 101% of what it should be. For the final tablets, the range is a bit wider, but still very tightly controlled. They also check things like dissolution, how quickly the tablet dissolves in the body, and uniformity, making sure each tablet in a batch has the same amount.
Sounds thorough. So lots of checks and balances to ensure quality and consistency. Now, let's talk about the regulatory side of things. How does a drug like acetaminophen get approved and then regulated?
Well, it's a complex landscape with different authorities in different countries. In the U.S., we have the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. In Europe, it's the EMA, the European Medicines Agency.
Right, and they're responsible for making sure drugs are safe and effective before they hit the market.
Exactly. And there are also international efforts to harmonize regulations. The ICH, the International Council for Harmonization, is one example, and the World Health Organization is involved as well.
So, trying to create some global standards. What about the EMA specifically? How does it work?
The EM has several key committees. One is the CHMP, the Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use. They evaluate new drug applications. Then there's the PRAC, the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee. They monitor drug safety once a drug is already on the market.
So they keep an eye on things and make sure no unexpected problems arise?
Right. And the CMDH, the Coordination Group for Mutual Recognition and Decentralized Procedures, that one helps harmonize standards for medicines that are approved nationally in different European countries.
Okay, so lots of different committees working to ensure safety and consistency. Now, acetaminophen wasn't always an over-the-counter drug. There was a time when you needed a prescription for it. When did that change?
That shift happened back in the 1950s. In the U.S., it became available over the counter in 1955. Interestingly, this was before the FDA's formal OTC drug review process was established.
So it was a different regulatory landscape back then.
It was. A similar shift happened in the UK and Europe around the same time. Panadol, for example, became available without a prescription in the UK in 1956.
What drove that change? Why did regulators decide it was okay to make it so readily available?
Well, the growing body of scientific evidence showed that it was generally safe and effective for self-treatment of mild pain and fever, as long as people followed the dosing instructions. And its gentler profile on the stomach, compared to aspirin, was also a factor.
So it was deemed safe enough for people to manage their own minor ailments. But regulations aren't static, are they? They evolve over time.
You're right. Regulatory agencies have taken different actions over the years to try to maximize safety. One major area is setting dosage limits. In the U.S., the FDA initially set those limits, for example, 3 to 900 milligrams per day for the 325 milligram tablets. But as concerns about liver toxicity from overdose grew, there were discussions about lowering those limits.
Yeah, what happened?
In 2011, the FDA took action, specifically targeting prescription combo products that contain acetaminophen. They asked manufacturers to limit the amount of acetaminophen in each pill or capsule to 325 milligrams. Around that same time, Johnson & Johnson, the makers of Tylenol, they voluntarily lowered the max daily dose for their extra-strength products.
So proactive steps to reduce the risk of accidental overdose. What about the warnings on the packaging?
Warnings about liver damage from taking too much. Those have been added to labels over time. More recently, there's been a lot of attention on potential links between acetaminophen use during pregnancy and neurodevelopmental issues in kids, things like ADHD and autism, and even an increased risk of asthma.
That's a very sensitive topic. What have the regulators said about these concerns?
The FDA and EMA, they both carefully reviewed the evidence. So far, they've maintained that it's not strong enough to warrant changing the official recommendations on acetaminophen use during pregnancy. They point out limitations in the studies, things like potential biases and other factors that could explain the associations. However, the EMA did update the product information for paracetamol in 2019, stating that studies on neurodevelopment were inconclusive. They advised that if paracetamol is used during pregnancy, it should be at the lowest effective dose for the shortest possible time.
So a cautious approach. What about other regulatory actions?
In 2014, the EMA recommended suspending modified-release paracetamol products in Europe.
Modified release?
Those are designed to release the drug slowly over a longer time. The concern was that these formulations could make it harder to manage overdoses, especially figuring out when to give the antidote.
Makes sense. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the controversies and legal issues surrounding acetaminophen.
Yeah. The big one, of course, is the liver damage caused by overdoses. It's a serious medical problem. And these overdoses, they can happen intentionally or unintentionally.
Unintentional overdose, how does that happen?
Often it's because people don't realize that acetaminophen is in so many different medications. They might be taking multiple products without even knowing they're all adding to their daily dose, or they might just be exceeding the recommended amount. And combining it with alcohol, that also increases the risk of liver damage.
Okay, so unintentional overdose is a real concern. Let's talk about the mechanism, the how and why acetaminophen can damage the liver.
All right, so normally when you take acetaminophen, most of it gets processed in your liver, transformed into harmless byproducts, and then it's eliminated from your body.
The liver's like the detox center.
Exactly. But there's a small percentage that goes down a different pathway in the liver. It gets metabolized by a different set of enzymes, and this produces a very reactive and toxic substance called NAPQI.
NAPQI, that's the bad guy.
It is. But under normal circumstances, the liver has a way to deal with it. There's an antioxidant in the liver called glutathione. It neutralizes NAPQI, keeps it from causing damage.
So glutathione is like the liver's bodyguard.
Good analogy.
Mm.
But when you take a huge dose of acetaminophen, those normal detox pathways get overloaded. You're producing way more NAPQI than the glutathione can handle.
And that's when the trouble starts.
Right. The excess NAPQI starts binding to proteins in the liver cells, especially in the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cells. This binding messes up mitochondrial function, disrupts energy production, and increases the levels of these harmful reactive oxygen species. All of that leads to cell damage and death in the liver.
Sounds like a cascade of badness. Are some people more susceptible to this type of damage?
Yes, definitely. Some factors that increase the risk are, well, obviously a massive overdose,
Mm.
but also delaying medical treatment. If it's been more than 8 hours since the overdose, that's not good. Chronic heavy alcohol use, that can increase the activity of the enzymes that make NAPQI, so that's a risk factor. And if your glutathione levels are low, for example, due to malnutrition or alcoholism, you're more vulnerable. Having pre-existing liver disease also increases the risk. And as we said before, unintentional overdoses from taking multiple medications, that's a common scenario.
So lots of things can compound the problem. What are the warning signs? How do doctors diagnose an overdose?
The early symptoms can be pretty nonspecific: nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, maybe some abdominal pain. As the liver gets damaged, you might see pain in the upper right abdomen, and later on, jaundice, which is that yellowing of the skin and eyes.
Mm.
Blood tests will show elevated liver enzymes. In really severe cases, it can lead to confusion, coma, even kidney failure.
That's scary stuff.
It is. Diagnosis involves getting a good history, figuring out how much was taken, when it was taken. The clinical presentation, the symptoms are important, and blood tests are crucial. They measure the acetaminophen level in the blood, and there's this tool called the Rumac-Matthew nomogram. It helps doctors estimate the risk of liver damage based on that blood level and the time since ingestion.
So time is of the essence.
Yeah, absolutely. The sooner treatment is started, the better. And the good news is there is an antidote. It's called N-acetylcysteine, or NAC.
NEC, I've heard of that.
It works by replenishing glutathione, which we talked about earlier. It helps the liver detoxify that nasty NAPQI. It's most effective if given within 8 hours of the overdose, but it can still be beneficial even later.
So there's hope even if it's not caught immediately.
Yes, but it's important to remember that even with NAC, severe liver damage and even death can still occur. It depends on the severity of the overdose and other factors.
It's sobering to realize that something we often reach for without much thought can have such serious consequences. What's being done to prevent these overdoses?
Well, there are the lower recommended doses, the restrictions on certain formulations like the modified release products, and there are public awareness campaigns trying to educate people about reading labels carefully and understanding the risks of taking too much.
Education is key. Now, the issue of liver damage has also led to lawsuits, right? Against the makers of Tylenol.
Yes, there's been a lot of litigation, primarily targeting Johnson & Johnson and their subsidiary McNeil. Many of the lawsuits were filed by people who suffered severe liver damage or by families of those who died, alleging that it was a result of Tylenol use. There were early cases in the 90s, a big case in 2007 that resulted in a large payout. And over the years, there have been many more lawsuits, some of them consolidated into multi-district litigation, which often end up in settlements. More recently, there have been lawsuits alleging a link between acetaminophen use during pregnancy and those neurodevelopmental issues in kids, although the status of those cases is still unclear. And then, of course, there was the Tylenol tampering crisis back in 1982, which really shook public trust in over-the-counter drugs. That was a criminal act, not directly related to the drug itself.
Right, a very different situation. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the economic impact of acetaminophen. It's such a widely used drug, it must be a big market.
It is. Acetaminophen is a substantial part of the global pharmaceutical market. The numbers vary a bit depending on the source, but we're talking billions of dollars, and projections show continued growth.
And within that market, there's the dynamic between the big brand names like Tylenol and the generics.
Exactly. And there's a significant price difference. Generics are usually much cheaper, often half the price or even less. That's because generic manufacturers don't have the same R&D costs or marketing expenses as the brand name companies. While Tylenol still has a big market share, the generics really dominate by volume.
So generics are making it more affordable. What about the costs associated with managing overdoses? That's got to be a burden on the healthcare system.
It is. Studies have looked at the costs of managing acetaminophen overdose and treating with NAC. The estimates vary, but it can be several $1,000s per patient, depending on factors like whether NAC is given intravenously or orally and the level of care required.
So pretty expensive.
Yes. And there's also the cost of unnecessary NAC treatment. Sometimes it's given when the risk of liver damage is actually low. So making sure treatment guidelines are followed is important, not just for patient safety, but also for cost effectiveness.
Makes sense. Okay, last but not least, let's touch on the cultural impact of acetaminophen. It's such a staple in our medicine cabinets.
It is. And its cultural status is really tied to its history, especially its rise as the safe alternative to aspirin after the Ray's syndrome scare. While it was already marketed as gentler on the stomach, those aspirin warnings really cemented its image as the go-to, especially for children.
And the media played a role in shaping that perception, right?
Absolutely. The media coverage of the Ray's syndrome issue was really widespread. It influenced public behavior, led to a decrease in aspirin use and an increase in acetaminophen use, and manufacturers certainly capitalized on that in their marketing.
So it became ingrained in our culture as the safe option.
Exactly. But that can also lead to people underestimating its potential for harm, especially since it's in so many combination products, they might not even realize they're taking it.
And the Tylenol tampering crisis, while not directly related to the drug itself, also had a big impact.
It did. It was a huge reminder of the vulnerabilities of over-the-counter drugs. And Johnson & Johnson's response, that became a model for crisis management. They issued public warnings, recalled the product, and introduced tamper-resistant packaging. That actually led to industry-wide adoption of tamper-evident packaging.
So a positive outcome from a terrible situation.
Yeah. And even routine marketing and advertising have shaped acetaminophen's image over the years, although some have criticized manufacturers for downplaying the risks of overdoses.
So overall, acetaminophen has had a huge impact on how we deal with everyday pain and fever.
It has. And it's a really good example of how a drug can become deeply embedded in society and public health practices. But it also highlights the responsibility that comes with that, the importance of using it safely and understanding both its benefits and its risks.
Well said. This has been a truly fascinating deep dive. I feel like I know acetaminophen on a whole new level.
Me too. It's always amazing how much there is to learn about even the most common medications.
So for our listeners, we hope this has given you a better understanding of acetaminophen. Please remember to always read those labels carefully and be mindful of everything you're taking to avoid those accidental overdoses.
And here's a final thought. Given how widely used acetaminophen is and the ongoing research, what will its future hold? Will we see new applications? What more will we learn about its mechanisms and safety? Something to ponder.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.